Cialis and cognitive function. What's going on, Kolton?
How's it going, man?
Excellent.
How's it going?
Today we want to talk about penis pills and cognitive function.
Yeah, I think PDE5 inhibitors are definitely an underutilized resource in our tool bank as far as the things that they do is sort of like an off-target effect of using boner pills at the end of the day, right? Most people use them in reference to, okay, I want to increase my blood flow, obviously for sexual function, but I also want to increase my blood flow for gym purposes, right? A better pump and nutrient delivery to muscle tissue, which there's some validity in that. But I think there's a lot more that needs to be looked at in relation to the effects that Cialis, tadalafil in specific, has in our body, and in a beneficial sense too. And a lot of those things relate to our cerebral function and in general our cognitive capacity. And we were just talking about this beforehand too, and how we don't really know the mechanisms of breakdown of cognitive function, right? Like dementia at large is still this very complex subject that we have a few strands of thought as to why this might happen in people and how it might happen, but really there's not much there. And so if we can take precautions that we do know at least objectively manage cerebral function or cognitive function at large in a positive manner, it's probably the best option for us. And there's a lot of, even beyond cognitive benefits, there's a lot that I love tadalafil. It's like one of my favorite compounds just in general, because it does so many cool things in relation to depression, but also, you know, penile function. And even there's some evidence to support that it could upregulate androgen receptors, but that's also sparse. You know? So
but you never know. Yeah.
Yeah, you never know. And there's like these different concepts that are really appealing to it. So I think maybe, how do you want to break this down? Do you just want to go step by step, kind of the things that I think?
Yeah, we could do that. But I was curious, how did you stumble? How did you end up on the depression connection? What were you looking at when you found this? Yeah. You're totally right. There's tons of data actually on this, but it's really interesting that you found this.
So early on when I started doing things, right, like in general bodybuilding. So I competed naturally, and I tell this story a lot, but I think it's important. I competed naturally, and I won my pro card naturally. But every fucking day I woke up and was like dieting naturally. I was like, why the hell am I doing this? Like, I'm so intrigued by this pharmacology stuff and at large biohacking. And I thought it was just this really interesting concept. So as we do, I researched everything. I tried to accumulate as much information and just became an autodidact by nature. And I say this a lot as well. I went to school, but I didn't learn anything applicable in school. The only thing I learned was how to research and like how to read data, go through the methods, and actually understand more than just the abstract. And so what I would do is basically find a compound I was interested in. At the time, it was Cialis. Research it heavily, you know, try to find every review that is relevant and modern on it that I possibly can. And one of the reviews I stumbled across was related to its effects on depression and possibly a use case for treatment of depression and anxiety in humans, which blew my mind, because here you have this like penis pill, right? And this thing that people sort of laugh about and talk about, oh, you're taking fucking tadalafil, right? But it has these extraordinary benefits to cognitive function. And I was like, this is super interesting. And so that brought me down a pathway of, okay, well, what are the off target, if you want to even call them that, effects of a PDE5 inhibitor? And it turns out there's quite a few that are beneficial. So experiments came, right? And I was like trying these things, partly due to Vigorous Steve, honestly, because I used to talk to him way, way early on back in the day. And it's one of the things he recommended just for fun, more or less, right? Because it has obviously a promotion of blood flow in the gym, which feels good. But then as I started taking it, I started realizing, okay, like I genuinely feel better as I take this compound. And it is more of a sort of what I found anecdotally, and it's not much, right? But a clearing of brain fog was maybe the best way to describe it, if I had that. So it's something that I think is pretty relevant in our fields and can be used in more ways than just one. And we often take a lot of ancillaries to protect or be preemptive about protecting certain organs, like ARBs, ACE inhibitors, you know, beta-2, all these different compounds. I think why not take something to protect the cognitive side of things if it is there as well.
Yeah, with using a PDE, like a lot of guys push the envelope, right? The brain will suffer over time.
Yeah.
What
especially when we're talking like hypertension, right? Or even in an off season with having high blood glucose. Like realistically, the vascular damage that can happen from having 130 milligram per deciliter blood glucose for over 6-8 hours is horrible. It's not good. And that does affect your cerebral vasculature as well. And it's not left alone just completely. Same thing with hypertension, right? As those vasculatures constrict, you have issues develop really quickly within your brain. And if we can prevent against those things in any capacity, I think it's a really good idea.
Definitely. So what's the first mechanism here that we're looking at?
So I think that the first one anyone could probably come to the conclusion of, and it doesn't take much to figure it out, but tadalafil at large as a phosphodiesterase type 5 inhibitor, it can actually, obviously it's used to treat erectile dysfunction, but that main mechanism involves the inhibition of this enzyme phosphodiesterase, which leads to vasodilation. And this extends beyond penile tissue, which is, again, I think most people think of this as like a dick pill. And sure, it does definitely work as that, and it makes that a great function of life as well. But it also includes cerebral blood vessels. So it dilates cerebral blood vessels, enhancing blood flow to the brain, which actually improves cognitive function, and has been shown to be something that can orchestrate an antidepressive effect as well. And this is theorized. Again, mechanisms here are sparse, but they're there. As you said, there's a lot of research. And one of the theorizations is that the increased oxygenation of gray matter and tissue in general in the brain is that you have increased mood and perception of mood. And this is sort of what I think most people might lack in our group, is because of the most often, I think, if people are working with us, they usually aren't, but I think most often people are hypertensive. They have a high heart rate. They are very sympathetic and nervous state. And so that sort of constant constriction and inhibition of blood flow can create mood disorders more often than not. Yeah. And it's one pathway I don't think we look at.
No. And the PEDs themselves can cause mood disorders. And you and I have talked about that before. So it's a multifaceted thing. And erections in and of themselves are generally there's one or two causes when there's an issue, right? It's generally emotional or mood, or it's blood flow issue. So it's kind of interesting if this can actually manage to some degree both.
Right. Exactly. And you were mentioning before the call too, that there might be some off-targeted reasons beyond just point A to point B that it causes antidepressive action. One of those is, it's fair to mention, right, not all this is causation. So there could be correlation beyond what we're seeing here, which is it improves your dick function, right? Like you're going to be a depressed man if your penis doesn't work like it should. And so if your penis starts working like it should, obviously that will have some antidepressive qualities to it. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the studies was speculating that could be a portion of the outcome there. It's just an interesting way to look at it, right? Because we know the amount of things in our world too that affect depression. Like there was that study at Johns Hopkins where they looked at almost 7,000 men that were clinically depressed and medicated, and they found that the vast majority of them were hypogonadal, right? They were low in testosterone, and when they actually put them on testosterone, it fixed the depression for the majority of them. So there's a lot of different ways that are not being looked at right now for mental health, and unfortunately probably won't be looked at anytime soon.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things that Cialis is unfortunately rather expensive, off-brand variants of it. It's, doctors aren't really willing to prescribe it as liberally as they are other things, which even different PDE5 inhibitors. I mean, Viagra or sildenafil is going to be prescribed 10 times more than tadalafil in a clinical setting. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe but it just seems like every time I have a guy go to the doctor and he does get prescribed, and even myself, it's always, all right, we're going to have to do to Cialis sorry, not Cialis, but Viagra or the off-brand version of it. Right. So I don't know why that is, but
it could just be the pharmaceutical offerings or doctor's preference, right? It was the original one. Just to me, Viagra seems very inconvenient to use.
Very,
right? It needs to be very planned. The food has to be very planned. Where Cialis it's a much longer half-life. It doesn't really matter if you eat or not eat.
Yeah,
and it's just all a better drug. And with blood flow, I mean, that's how Viagra was discovered. It was cardiac medicine at first, and then the side effect was erections. So
Right.
it's
Right.
so it kind of actually started with blood flow, but just to a different area.
Yeah. Now, I have a question for you. Do you know what Doppler flow? I could fuck this up. We were just talking about how I read studies, but I don't say stuff, so it's hard to, replicate what I'm reading. But Doppler flowmetry is in terms of testing or magnetic resonance.
Like blood flow?
Yeah, like testing for cerebral blood flow, for instance, using Doppler flowmetry.
I've heard of it, but I'm not that familiar with it. No. Is this something that's been shown with Cialis that increases?
Yeah. So there was a study done in 2015 by I'm again going to mess this up. Hoda et al. But this was one of the ones that I read, and it was actually really interesting because it had really good data to support, again, in animal models. But using this testing model, they found that it did increase cerebral blood flow and vessel dilation in cognitive tissues. And what it found was that it improved working memory of mammals, which I thought was really interesting. And the thought was in both young and aged mammals that it caused increases in working memory, which is super favorable as well.
Yeah. Oxidative stress is huge, right? I mean, you can even look at things like cholesterol and realize that even a lot of the things that we associate with cholesterol issues are more of an oxidative stress issue and not so much, right? It's when it's oxidized is when the issue occurs, even in the brain.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense that the more blood flow, oxygenated blood flow you have to those areas of the brain, the better it's going to work.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think beyond just the pro like performance enhancing parts of it, right, where you have increases in cognitive performance or decreases in depressive symptoms, you also have like neuroprotective benefits. And we were talking about this beforehand too, but tadalafil possesses a unique ability. Well, I think at large, it's not just tadalafil, but PDE5 inhibitors in general have an ability to modulate cyclic guanosine monophosphate, or GMP, the signaling pathway. And by inhibiting PDE5, tadalafil increases GMP, which in turn activates protein kinases and promotes the expression of neuroprotective factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, for instance.
Yeah, it's like a foundation of RNA.
Yeah, yeah, and it seemingly can help aid in cognitive function instead of just improving it, but also like protecting it. And there was a study done in 2018 that tested these are rat model data, so it's obviously not super applicable, but there's human models as well. But they actually used tadalafil, and they found that tadalafil treatment did reduce neuronal damage, and in general, improved rates of oxidation within the brain. So there's definitely.
Was that related to amyloid plaque? Was that one of those studies?
No. This was a relatively recent one in general. This is just testing the mechanisms involved in tadalafil causing and modulation GMP. And so they were looking at it, and they found that there was less markers of, and please forgive me because I'm not super aware of cerebral testing, but they found that there was less oxidative stress within the cerebral areas, right?
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's almost acting as an antioxidant.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a part of what we talk a lot about. For people watching this, we talk probably 40 minutes before these calls, but we were talking about how the interesting effect of Cialis is that, the interesting effect of having erectile dysfunction is that it is kind of a canary in the coal mine, in the sense that it can be indicative of a lot of other issues like if your dick isn't working, there's a lot going on, and you need to be pretty cognizant of what that might be. And one of those things is oxidative stress, and like that enabling a lot of other issues as well. Another is like arterial blockage. I think a lot of people don't realize that you have a very high possibility that, if you're an older guy and you've had some cardiovascular issues before, or at least in present or past blood work, there's been some concerns and your dick isn't working. There's actually genuine concern that there's blood flow interruption systemically, not just locally. But
calcium score, triglycerides, those things, ApoB.
Right.
Yeah. It's erection is, for a man, like we talked about before, is like a basic sign of health. It's the last, from a hormone point of view, it's literally the last thing that goes, right? If a guy is losing his erection due to testosterone, it's at the way end of the range. That occurs, in the 300s generally, because it's one of the primary functions of, unfortunately, being a male mammal, is to be able to achieve an erection. So when that goes, it just shows that many other things have gone as well. So it's a pretty bad sign. If it goes from arterial blockage or something, you obviously have a lot of other things going on as well that are not good.
Yeah.
It's and we, another interesting thing that the new data shows, because I know on our group podcast we talked, Todd had mentioned something like proviron for erections, and I was going to clear something up. So the current data actually shows that DHT seems relatively irrelevant, or at least unknown, when it comes to erections in men. It seems as long as testosterone is stable or amongst groups, what really seems to affect erections the most is actually estrogen. So, and you can dictate symptoms basically by where the estrogen is. Like premature ejaculation generally occurs when estrogen is slightly elevated. And then as it continues to elevate, you'll obviously then lose the ability to achieve erection, which anyone who's used too many aromatizing steroids can attest to. And the same if, again, testosterone is equalized. If estrogen is too low, you also have the inability to achieve an erection. And that would be more like prolonged, like a prolonged erection, like almost like a porn star would be like low, suppressed estrogen, right? Where you can achieve it, but it's not, you're never finishing.
What do you think about then if that's the case? Because a lot of this has been put out, by some people in the past, and even Steve. I have no problem quoting people who've said stuff. Vigorous Steve said that he tried topical DHT locally and saw no real effect. I'm curious what your thoughts are there. So would that be effective?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of studies right now on hormones in serum, because this seems to be a very big area in cancer. So for a long time, we were using different markers in the blood, just like we use with bodybuilders, right? We look at estradiol, we look at testosterone, we're looking at DHT, and we're trying to guess an outcome like, oh, your hair will fall out because your DHT is elevated, or this will happen because of estrogen. And sometimes we find, I'll speak more specifically to bodybuilders because the audience is probably not, in oncology, kind of thing. It's more, well, sometimes we'll find symptoms still occur even though the blood work doesn't line up to that. Like, well, why is that occurring? And so with DHT specifically, we've recently found that serum DHT is a relatively useless marker of anything. So it's basically what's been spit out of the cell. So the 5-alpha reductase occurs inside the cell once testosterone enters, and that's also the rate limit in its conversion. So the amount of 5-alpha reductase you have is going to dictate how much DHT can be produced. The DHT that's produced inside the cell is what's actually acting on the cell, right? The excess that's on the outside that's floating in our blood that we measure actually has very little effect on the body. It can't actually enter the cell because it's bound to sex hormone binding globulin. And in the case of DHT, when bound, it renders it completely useless. And sex hormone binding globulin in that case, when bound to DHT, is also not able to bind to its own receptor. So it basically, the DHT and serum test, outside of maybe some very specific needs, it really doesn't show us anything. You're basically looking at the waste product that's left the cell. And the same with estrogen. This is kind of an interesting thing as well. And this will explain why. To go to your question before I go to estrogen, when Steve would apply it topically, it'd be the same as it in serum. It's not actually entering the cell because DHT externally cannot enter in that method. It's actually testosterone that's going in and entering. Now, anabolic steroids that are DHT based have been altered. So that's a different case. They are able to go in.
Right.
If you're getting that's a whole different thing. Like a proviron's a poor example because proviron's basically DHT. Primobolan and masteron, any of those things have been physically altered so they can, chemically altered so they can enter. Estradiol, for instance, a lot of times, I don't know if you've ever seen, you might have a guy who tests, perhaps his estrogen shows as lower, right? It's 30s or 40s, and he's had a high androgen load, and yet he's experiencing estrogen-like symptoms, like this water retention, perhaps got some form of gyno going on, but you're like, I can't crush your estrogen because it's a 29.
Yeah.
You actually, technically now, the medical treatment for that is you still are supposed to use something like Arimidex to lower the estrogen because you're not actually seeing the whole picture. Again, what matters is the estrogen inside the cell, not the estrogen on the outside of the cell. So again, it's not that the estrogen in the serum is totally useless, but you're again just seeing a byproduct of what's basically being spit out as trash. So sometimes you don't get a ton of excess that leaves the cell. So you might get a false reading on the total that's in serum. And that's what we see with IGF as well. You know, and I've been saying this stuff till I'm blue in the face, that the IGF that's in serum, a lot of that is bound and not really doing anything. So it's not really measuring anything useful for you or I. For things like cancer, it might have some application. But for bodybuilders, just getting it really high in serum doesn't necessarily matter. What you're looking for is inside the muscle, right? And a lot of that is converted either through anabolics or mechanical tension will allow that to occur. And it responds to glucose generally. Estrogen, although will affect the levels, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's making it more active. I think that's where people go wrong. It's not an estrogen responsive hormone. It's a glucose responsive hormone. Hence the term insulin growth factor. It's not estrogen growth factor.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of thing. So when you apply DHT topically, it's probably not going anywhere.
Okay. So a couple of questions stem from that then. In relation to testosterone being inside the cell, and then that's where it gets converted into DHT. And this might be me just completely lacking prerequisite knowledge, but isn't like the ligand outside, isn't it extracellular, you know, where testosterone or any androgen rather would be binding to a receptor site?
It'll bind there and then it's pulled in. So it'll translate. Okay. It'll move to the cell surface. You also have the cellular membrane receptors that do not come in. Those are those are like the non-genomic responses. And so GHT can still react. There probably is some level of serum DHT that might react in some respect to those receptors. But again, that's going to be moderate, because what you're talking about in serum is going to be a physiological level generally. It's not generally going to be enough to cause a non-genomic response. So in case people won't watch some of the other videos, the difference is genomic response is the androgen receptor moves to the cell surface, binds to an androgen, and that it doesn't have to be testosterone. It could be nandrolone, it could be trembolone, it could be anything that's going to bind, and it will then get pulled into the cell surface, right? And then through a series of steps, it basically causes gene transcription and protein synthesis, and that's how most anabolic steroids work. Kind of the short. Yeah. And then you have other receptors that are basically never really leave the cell membrane. Those bind and they cause a response immediately. And that's what you see when you typically see something like oral steroid, like a halotestin, cause a huge strength increase very quickly within hours, or even Anavar. If you're very attuned to some things, you can take Anavar right before a workout, right? And your strength might go up a little bit. That's a non-genomic. That doesn't mean that's causing tissue growth. That just means that that's causing that. And we also see that more with side effects. Like you and I've talked before, is like people judge androgens not just on the pure tissue expression. They love to judge them by the side effects. They're like, well, I like Anadrol 50 because I'm very strong, or I don't feel good. My appetite's garbage. Those are side effects. Those aren't positive effects of the drugs. And a lot of times those are non-genomic effects that you're getting because it's hitting those receptors on other organs and other things. Like all of our organs have androgen receptors and estrogen receptors, and
right. So short of doing I've talked about this a lot, and you've mentioned it as well. It's like what we care about is the intracellular, not the extracellular. And unfortunately, we don't have easily accessible ways to test intracellular mechanics. Short of muscle biopsy, is there anything that a bodybuilder could do to reasonably venture down that path?
Which one, to test what, like IGF or something in the muscle?
Correct. True intracellular response might be.
The simplest way would be the outcome, right? Like what is occurring? Are they getting bigger?
Yeah.
I mean, you could in theory probably pay. LabCorp in the United States is not going to do a biopsy for you. You could probably pay a doctor somewhere to do Thailand. They'd probably do that for you. You could probably get a biopsy done. It would probably not feel very good. The needles have gotten smaller. It's not something I would recommend, but that's how they do the gene studies. Yeah. Looking at gene expression there. There's 88 genes that steroids interact with that we know of inside muscle cells. And that's how they find these things. I would say the simplest outcome for bodybuilders to check is like, regardless of what the numbers say, what is actually occurring? Are you getting bigger, stronger? Are you getting leaner? Whatever the goal is it occurring? If it's not occurring, it's not working.
Yes. Yeah, I think that
sounds like a cop out of an answer. I don't know of any easier way to determine what's going on in there.
I think that is a beautiful answer, because at the end of the day, what it says is you can speculate mechanism based on serum levels and studies based on serum levels all day long, but what is the effect you're actually experiencing? And that question, when it's answered, you'll know indefinitely what you need to do to get growth. And it's one that we overlook so much when we're talking about evidence-based research, because we're limited by science with what we know and what we can test. And if you're just to look past that and say, what am I as an N=1? What am I experiencing individually? And that is so much more, it has so much more utility than basing your claims off any sort of research, which is unfortunate because research is very valuable and it does have a place, right? Like it gives us so much insight, but as an individual response to a certain compound, what is happening intracellularly, it's very hard to tell. And you have to do the experimenting to figure that out for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the science really it's generally used for other things. All of that research is from oncology. It's to figure out methods of cancer detection and to figure out how we can stop cancer. But we can apply a lot of those things to bodybuilding. There's not a lot of research being done directly on anabolics at the moment because it's mostly irrelevant at this point. But I think, you know, and my dad said something to me when I was younger, and I'll say this because he watches every video that I make, embarrassingly enough. He said that there's two types of people. There's process people and there's results people, and successful people tend to be results driven and unsuccessful people tend to be process driven. You find lots of people in gyms that are not in very good shape, but if you ask them, they go to the gym. Well, going to the gym is a process, right? What have they accomplished at the gym? That's why I brought that up. I just think, like, instead of focusing on all the silly stuff that I focus on, like, has your body changed? Like, do you look different now than you did 2 months ago? Right? You're obviously, something is not correct if you don't, unless you're just trying to maintain some sort of appearance. But I think that we get so in the weeds with some of this stuff that I think that's almost the most valuable thing that we can take from this is what is the outcome?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's at the end of the day, like, no matter what anyone says, it's the outcome that matters, right? If you're trying to get to a specific goal. So what works for you is the most applicable at the end of the day.
Like, you and I are in a group chat, just so people, you know, that watching this, like, we're in a group chat. I don't even know how many guys are in it now. It keeps growing. And there's a couple of us, and we'll go back and forth. We'll argue about different numbers and blood work. Like, we'll get our blood work done and we'll post it, and we'll like, in a friendly way, we'll argue about what these things mean and what they don't mean. And it's like, the thought always comes back to my mind is like, do you look any different? Like, why does it matter?
Right.
You know,
right.
I know the guy who I'm specifically talking about is probably going to watch this video too. So I'm not really making fun of him. I'm just,
well, this is a huge issue in the industry at large. And unfortunately, it's what a lot of coaches can prey off of people with too, because a coach might say, oh, your white blood cells are high, and that means you have an like GI issue. You likely have SIBO. And it could be that, like, they might actually have SIBO, but at the end of the day, they also could have just got a fucking paper cut, you know, like, and that coach will go ahead and, you know, sign them on for 12 weeks and say, all right, we have to go through this gut protocol and fix your SIBO because you have SIBO. And it's just,
look at miraculous, it fixed itself because the paper cut healed.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's scary. It's very scary to see.
I mean,
like,
I think it's good for clients when coaches can interpret these things, right? Because if we're messing with things that could be risky, it's good to have someone in your corner that can at least understand this. Most of my clients don't know how to read their own blood work.
Yeah.
And most doctors that I encounter don't necessarily read their own. I saw blood work today from an oncologist that really had no oncogenes tested. So I'm not sure. So you see all sorts of craziness, you know, and this is someone who does that for a living. But yeah, I think also sometimes coaches like to jump to conclusions with things that aren't necessarily accurate.
Yeah.
You know? And the serum stuff could definitely be one of those things. Awesome, man. Well, thank you. I appreciate you coming on, as always.
Good conversation.
Thanks. I'll put your link tree down below. Kolton is obviously a coach, an author. He's probably the most well-read person that I'm aware of on this planet. Definitely read more studies, more books than anyone else I've ever met. And you're a dear friend. Well, thanks, buddy.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Yeah.